Good day, everyone! London Onion here, returning with yet another Invader Prime build, receiving an Onion approval for the Apocalypse difficulty. Now, our last one was rather strange, but I think the Invader invites unconventional strategies for their survival, and this Onion would argue that the trend will continue with today's discussion. As a small silver lining, our accompanying archetype today will be the Handler, with our favorite doggo companion, Rufus. So as this Onion has determined in our previous videos, the Invader is primarily a defensive archetype. Our Handler, on the other hand, does not necessarily fit into an archetypal box, which essentially is their place on the spectrum of classes and roles. The Handler is versatile enough to adapt to virtually any style. Like the Summoner, the Handler is ineffective without their doggo companion. The synergy between these two is not obvious in this Onion's opinion. Outside of their damage boost, the other perks are nice small advantages, but they don't necessarily work for each other on their own. The archetype traits are also complete strangers to each other, and for this build, the kinship trait is not even on the stove. But even with all of this stated, we'll take advantage of the Handler's versatility and adapt it with the Invader's meta, starting with the build. Armor in this build remains non-prescriptive, but as usual, I aim to maximize armor effectiveness with a mixture of the Leto Mark II and Bruiser armor constituents. For our relic, I employ the Shielded Heart, which grants a 100% shield for 20 seconds. The shards I equip are shield effectiveness, skill cooldown, and consumable use speed. Moving on to the weapons, the primary I prefer is the Royal Hunting Bow, with the Scrapshot mod and the Supercharger Mutator. This primary is purely up to preference, but I would say that this Onion is biased toward bows in this game. The secondary I equip is the Service Pistol, with the Tremor mod and Twisting Wounds Mutator. The melee weapon is up to preference, but this Onion would highly recommend a melee weapon with ranged capability. For this build, I go with the Hero Sword with Shielded Strike. Viable alternatives would be the Huntress Spear, Krell Axe, Atom Splitter, or potentially the Spectral Blade. Now for the fun part, our fashionable accessories. The amulet leading this build is the Vengeance Idol, which increases all damage dealt by 30% when the wearer's health is below 50%. The rings I equip are Black Cat Band, Restriction Cord, Ring of Crisis, and Generating Band. Black Cat Band saves one from death upon taking fatal damage, and reduces their health to a single unit. Movement speed will increase by 25% for 10 seconds, and the ring will go into a 2-minute cooldown. Restriction Cord caps the wearer's health at 50%, and reduces all incoming damage by 15%. Ring of Crisis grants a 25% shield for 10 seconds upon health dropping below 25%. Lastly, Generating Band grants 3% of health per second while a shield is active. Speaking briefly on the skills, for the Invader, I maintain the Reboot skill, and for our lovely doggo companion Rufus, I keep him in the Guard Dog setting. While in Guard Dog mode, Rufus will generate 15% increased threat while attacking and reduce received damage by 20%. His Howl feature in this mode reduces damage by 15% for all allies within 20 meters, and he generates additional threat for 20 seconds. Topping off this build, the traits I go with are the Engineer's Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Bark Skin, Blood Bond, Recovery, and Rugged. Now we'll move on to this Onion's favorite part, the application and limitations. So the application for this one is rather simple. Distraction is your main key to seamless offense and survival, but we will tackle that in a hot second. Speaking first to our weapons, although I stated our primary as a preferential option, I am biased toward bows because of their silent profile, decent burst damage, and efficient use. The same goes for the Service Pistol, and Twisting Wounds is intended to work off of Rufus's bleed capability for a slight damage boost. Now, I value the Hero Sword most out of the other options. It's efficient in its ranged ability in conjunction with its swinging patterns for hitting multiple foes. The other options feel more restrictive, or have a longer load-up/recovery time in comparison. But this is not to say that they aren't good options, just not exactly this onion's preference for the build at hand. In regards to our amulet and rings, I hope this is not some sort of glitch or oversight, but although the amulet specifies being under 50% health, the restriction cord allows the amulet to be active at all times, granting a permanent 30% boost to damage even with a shield active. Black Cat Band, Ring of Crisis, and Generating Band all work together as a failsafe in the likely event of health dropping to critical levels. Black Cat Band activates after taking fatal damage, but being left at 1 health unit is superbly risky in this onion's opinion, especially if the fatal blow was elemental or comes with damage over time, to which one would meet their demise almost instantly. All 3 will activate simultaneously and give one a good chance at recovery, even if further damage is sustained. Now, Generating Band is literally our only means of health recovery, but there are a fair amount of avenues one can use to receive its effect. This can be through the melee weapon, hence why its ranged ability was so important, Ring of Crisis, and of course, our relic. But we're now going to transition deeper into the practical application of this build. Now, the skills are where this build shines. However, it is important to always keep in mind that one's health is capped at 50%, so shields are intended to be a heavy replacement. Outside of Ring of Crisis, this would be through melee or one's relic. With this in mind, Rufus should be one's first line of defense. He can, after all, take quite a beating while in his guard dog mode, so employing the single press command should be a frequent tactic. Naturally, his threat generation will draw in and steal the attention of most inbound foes. When significantly outnumbered, his Howl command should be employed first before resorting to reboot, and there are 2 reasons for this. After activating his skill, cooldown will begin shortly afterward. Reboot, on the other hand, begins its cooldown after deactivation. The second reason is due to the best friend perk of the handler. Upon using a relic, Rufus's health will be fully restored. He will have a 25% damage boost and 35% damage resistance for 15 seconds. Throughout my experiments, Rufus can draw quite a crowd and will sometimes need saving before getting incapacitated. Nothing will do this faster than a relic, or a pat on the head after a lull in combat, but most of the time, one won't have the luxury. If using the skills in reverse, one will likely have to use the relic without the reboot skill and ultimately lose out on relics unnecessarily. Emergencies, however, do occur, not just with Rufus, but with our user themselves. So in other words, there should be an escalation protocol. Use Rufus's Howl first if necessary. If enemy pressure persists after the Howl timer is up, then reboot can be employed. The beauty of this escalation protocol is that it can be repeated with a roughly 5 to 10 second delay from one skill to the next. First Howl to draw enemy attention and allow the user to pick off targets, then reboot for shields and regular decoy use. While reboot counts down, Rufus's Howl is cooling down. Once reboot has been stretched to its limit, Howl is not too far away. Then rinse and repeat as necessary. At this cadence, enemies should be regularly distracted from the user. Due to the timing gap in skills, this onion found it helpful to have mods that slow enemy progression to buy more time. Hence, Scrapshot and Tremor. Other options are worthwhile, but they also are more expensive or have less charges. Not only will Rufus have fully restored health following a relic charge, but the user will also be shielded and can consequently be less timid in combat. The Invader's reboot is perfect for relic use, since one can hold on to its effects after reactivating the skill. Plus, the Invader's override perk reduces threat by 25%, leaving Rufus as the most quote-unquote threatening character on the battlefield. Both skills, however, give way to melee use, but in different ways. Due to the shield effectiveness shard, a single relic charge will grant 120% of one's health as a shield, and because of shielded strike, one can stand toe-to-toe with enemies and strike their foes directly without much worry for retaliation. Now, the hero's sword is not the most hard-hitting, but due to our weapon profiles, using a bow in tight spaces with numerous enemies is far from ideal, and the service pistol will only do so much without much room for maneuvering. So one can act as a discount challenger while on reboot, and attack without much hesitation. If just employing the Howl command, then using ranged combat tactics and the melee ranged ability for health replenishment or ammo conservation is appropriate. Chances are, Howl will be enough for most minor enemy occurrences, but escalation may be required when in a crescendo or boss fight. This will lead us into the brief but noteworthy limitations. The first one that I quickly came to know was that fall damage is not to be taken lightly. At half health, any fall damage can result in one's demise, and Black Cat Band won't save you. Bosses are not so easily distracted either by Rufus or one's decoys, but it does happen. However, the frequency is difficult to predict, and can potentially throw off one's process or put the user in a compromising circumstance when taking on bosses. This last one is a bit strange, but worth mentioning. Of all the ranged melee weapon options, the hero sword does take some getting used to compared to the other more popular throwables. One will need a good amount of clearance so that the energy wave can actually be issued, otherwise it will just hit a nearby wall of some sort. On a similar note, we aren't a challenger. Though we have recovery as a trait, just 3 consecutive energy waves will nearly deplete one's stamina, and this can be dangerous depending on circumstances, such as dodging a series of attacks. Lastly, and this one goes for every relic-heavy build, bosses and aberrations with the Empathy Mutator will demand a more conservative use. This will naturally cut down on one's frequency of decoys and put more use into Rufus. But what matters is taking off more health than one inadvertently replenishes. I would almost consider this another ultimate kiter build, but less speed and maneuverability, and more misdirection and survivability. At the end of the day, more of your enemies will spend time either chasing Rufus or your shadows. So I would still call this build a perfect distraction. Now I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.